All right, hello everybody and welcome. I'm Emily Connor from the Audubon Center at Riverlands. We're so glad that you could join us for our third Bird Friendly Friday. Today we're going to be talking about birds and light pollution. So don't forget that you can tune in each Friday at 2 p.m. for different topics on learning about tips and tricks for supporting birds. Now, as we adapt to a more virtual world, we hope that these bird-friendly Fridays are a fun addition to your Friday and will spark some meaningful ideas on how you can help birds at home. So to celebrate International Dark Sky Week, which is actually happening right now, we'll be discussing the impacts that light pollution have on birds. And first, we are going to be hearing from National Audubon Society's John Rowden and Connie Sanchez.
Recording.
Welcome, and thank you for joining National Audubon Society.
And welcome. My name is John Rowden. I'm the Senior Director for Bird-Friendly Communities at the National Audubon Society.
John and I are both part of Audubon's Bird-Friendly Communities team. So what do we mean by bird-friendly communities? With our bird-friendly communities efforts, we're seeking to provide food, shelter, safe passage, and places to raise young in the communities we share with birds across the country. Today, we'll be focusing on the safe passage aspect of this work, and in particular, the way that artificial night light affects our native bird species. John?
Thanks, Connie. So why is this an issue? So this satellite image gives an overall impression of the amount of light that's emitted at night across the United States. And if you think about it, this is a phenomenon that's only been in existence for about the past 150 years when we had the ability to actually beam light into the night sky. It's grown massively since then, and it continues to grow. And why does this matter to birds? So if we look at birds across the globe, about 19% are migratory. However, if we drill into North America, about 70% of the species that live in North America are migratory. And if we think about those migratory or those North American species, about 80% of those migrate at night. We think there are a few reasons for this. So migratory flight is obviously very energetically expensive, and it's actually cooler at night. So it may help keep birds cooler as they're making their migratory flights. They can also avoid flying at the same time as the birds that prey on them, since raptors generally migrate during the day. And also there's an additional resource for them to use to navigate by. That's the star map and the moon. And now these are navigational aids that have been present during their evolutionary history. Increasingly, they are getting obscured by all the light we're pumping into the sky, which is what we're talking about today. So how do we understand how birds are moving across the landscape at night when we can't necessarily see them? So one way to do that is with the use of radar. There are a network of 143 stations across the country that help us quantify the number of birds that are traveling across that landscape. So this image on the lower right shows what those radar images look like at these stations. So you can see that there's this concentration across the middle part of the country. And what that translates to is millions of birds traveling. And this happened to be on a night in April of 2017, where looking over time at what we can infer from these data, we can tell that up to 178 million birds were actually traveling, many of them through that central flyway across the middle part of the continent. Okay, so there's been a number of years, about 20 years, that people have been looking at this kind of information. And what we've learned is that billions of birds are actually moving across this landscape during fall migration and spring migration. So you can see that birds will be flying from the south, entering the US, and some large number still continuing on up into Canada in the spring. In the fall, the numbers are augmented by those baby birds that are produced by the breeding birds. And you can see that at the end of the day, over 4 billion birds are leaving the North American airspace during fall migration. It's a really massive, massive phenomenon. Now, the birds that are migrating face a number of challenges, and this slide shows what the built environment, how challenging that can be for them, and the risks to mortality for all of these structures across the landscape. During this presentation, again, we're really focusing on the impact of light, and we do really want to share some recent research that's helped us identify where we should focus our efforts to address artificial light at night to help migratory birds. So this slide shows a synthesis of data from a paper that was published in 2016, which shows that the top 125 cities in the country account for a very small amount of the landmass. But if you think back to the slide at the beginning of the presentation, they actually are broadcasting an immense amount of light into the atmosphere and account for 35.4% of the light reflectance across that landscape. But about half of the United States actually experiences light polluted nights. So more recently, there was a paper that was published last year, which looked at the data on these 125 cities and looked at the amount of birds that were flying through reflected in that radar data, and then overlaid that on the light emitted from these cities. And the authors used that to calculate an exposure index. So it actually is showing where birds are most exposed, at most risk of seeing artificial light at night, so that we can help pinpoint our activities where, if we do lights out activities, we can help them the most. So I'm going to show you this slide now. It's a little bit busy, so I wouldn't focus so much on the left-hand side of the slide, but more on the right-hand slide. So what this graph has is its fall rank with increasing exposure risk toward the right on the x-axis. On the y-axis, it's the spring rate with increasing exposure to the top. And what you can see is up here at this, the upper right corner, which is blown out here on the far right of the slide, is the cities that have the most risk both in spring and fall. And there's some interesting culprits here again in the middle of the country, Chicago being the #1 risk city for birds in spring and fall. And so that's again a combination of the fact that so many birds are traveling through that area, plus it's emitting a tremendous amount of light. But you can see there's a number of cities here on these axes that are problematic for birds. Okay, I'm going to hand it back to Connie to talk about Lights Out programs.
Thanks, John. So now, based on what we know, how do we address this issue that artificial light at night presents to birds? We've got Audubon's Lights Out program, a national effort that involves various partners across the Audubon network across the country. And these programs are focusing on raising awareness of the issue, engaging communities in taking action, and advocating for solutions to help. Audubon chapters, centers, state offices, they're all working with building owners and managers to turn off excess lighting during the months that migrating birds are flying overhead. And we're helping to provide them with safe passage between their nesting and their wintering grounds. So turning off bright lights helps birds move on within minutes. And this was discovered by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and New York City Audubon during the annual 9/11 memorial in New York City. Now, hundreds of birds are caught in the memorial's beams every year, but turning them off for just 20 to 30 minutes at a time greatly reduces the density of birds in the area. So taking more steps like this to decrease the amount of light our buildings emit really minimizes unnecessary bird deaths and can also save money by reducing energy consumption. A little bit more about the history of Lights Out efforts in the national network involved. The Fatal Light Awareness Program in Toronto was the first to raise awareness of the problem that lights pose for birds in an urban center starting in 1993. And in 1999, Audubon and partners established the first Lights Out program in Chicago. Now, since then, groups in many other cities have organized programs to make a difference for birds. You'll see here on the map, the yellow circles on this map show where Lights Out programs include partnerships with International Dark Sky Association. So they're working together in those areas. And you'll be hearing some more about these local efforts and collaborations in the St. Louis area focused on birds and light in a continuation of this presentation from our friends at IDA Missouri, Audubon Center at Riverlands, and the St. Louis Audubon Society. Now, a number of jurisdictions around the country have pursued efforts to address light pollution, and policy change is increasingly a focus of our collective Audubon efforts. Now, what can you do to help? Explore more about our Lights Out activities online on our Bird Friendly Communities site. Learn about the specific actions you can take for not just Lights Out, but as well as other Bird Friendly Communities programs. And connect with your local Audubon chapter, center, or state office to see how you can get involved in these activities and more. So stay tuned for more information about what's happening locally and reach out to us with any questions regarding bird-friendly buildings and Lights Out. Thank you.
All right, now that we've heard from John and Connie, let's take a deeper look at the impacts that light pollution have specifically in the St. Louis region. I'd like to introduce my coworker, Tara Hohman, who is the Conservation Science Associate at the Audubon Center at Riverlands. We will also be hearing from Don Ficken. He is the president of the International Dark Sky Association Missouri chapter, as well as Jean Favara, who is the vice president of conservation with St. Louis Audubon Society. Again, if you have any questions for our presenters, we will be having a live Q&A following this presentation, and you can post those questions in the Facebook live chat. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tara.
Thanks, Emily. So kind of diving off of what we just heard from John and Connie, the Mississippi Flyway is one of the largest migratory pathways used by birds in North America, ranging from Manitoba and Ontario, Canada, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So while most other flyways in North America are obstructed by mountain ranges or sided by an ocean, our flyway is unobstructed and is actually used by 60% of North American songbirds and about 40% of North American waterfowl. That ultimately encompasses over 325 different bird species out of the 900 plus species that can be found within the US. So one of the Mississippi Flyway's greatest resources is the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in their confluence here in the St. Louis region. So migratory birds use these waterways as a sort of roadmap to follow as they migrate north and south to their breeding and wintering grounds. And these rivers also provide ample resources to those birds while they're migrating. Next slide, please. So 14 of our 50 states encompass the Mississippi Flyway, here shown in green. And to the right of that, we can see the Atlantic Flyway. To the left of it, we can see the Central, and then to the far left, we can see the Pacific Flyway. Next slide. So birds that migrate can kind of be categorized into three different groups. One being residential. So these are birds that are going to stay in the same area, both in the summer and in the winter. But we also have two other groups that actually move back and forth. One of those being long distant migrants, like we have shown here, like the Baltimore Oriole. So this is one of our summer residents, but when they do leave for their wintering grounds, they'll fly all the way down to South and Central America, which is a pretty long way in the big scheme of things. Next. On the other hand, we have other birds like short distant migrants like ospreys. So these raptors, again, will summer here in the region. And when they leave for the winter, the farthest they'll travel is all the way down to the Gulf Coast, which isn't that big scheme of things. So like mentioned earlier, most of our birds migrate at night to their wintering or breeding grounds. So shown in this graphic, kind of what we've seen before, you can see that especially during spring, there's a high density of migration activity, and shown similarly in the fall, but it's a little bit more spread out. So anything that you see in yellow shows high activity, and then going down to blue, less so. So whenever there's light pollution given off by these urban centers and residential hubs, it ultimately ends up disorienting birds as they move from those breeding or wintering grounds and vice versa. So that usually ends with the birds being either overexhausted and ultimately colliding with windows. So currently, St. Louis is listed as the 5th most dangerous city for spring migrants and the 6th most dangerous city for all fall migrants.
Thank you, Tara. This is Jean Favara speaking on behalf of St. Louis Audubon Society. And one of the things you might ask is, what is St. Louis Audubon Society doing in response to this problem? Just recently, we established a new project called Bird Safe St. Louis, or Bird Safe STL. And the goal of this project is to establish long-term community relationships that will support bird safe practices and reduce bird fatalities due to light pollution and window collisions. And this project has been built on earlier work. One set of work was done by the St. Louis Chamber Arts Council Silent Skies Lights Out project. And another set of projects or work was done by St. Louis Audubon Society in 2000 and 2003 in those years. And St. Louis Audubon Society during those years did bird mortality surveys downtown. And out of that work came an agreement with the Gateway Arch National Park. And since 2001, the Gateway Arch spotlights that light up that arch are now turned off for 2 weeks during the spring and the fall migrations, protecting birds from being blinded by that light. And our project, Bird Safe St. Louis, has just going to start doing bird mortality surveys in the downtown area starting this fall. And that information will be used to help us understand what areas in downtown are unsafe for our local birds. Next slide.
So this is Don Ficken. I'm president of the International Dark Sky chapter for the state of Missouri, and I'm glad to be here. Many of you may not be aware of the International Dark Sky Association. It's a global organization. It's been around since 1988, has something like 65 chapters. It's in 28 countries, and it's really considered the world's leading authority on light pollution. Globally, light pollution is increasing something like 2.2% per year. And of course, today's program is really focusing on birds directly, but when you look at the ecosystems surrounding that are impacted by light pollution, there's 60% of invertebrate are actually nocturnal. And so when you start thinking about birds, the food supplies, for example, there was actually an article in today's Post-Dispatch about Earth's insect populations shrinking by something like 30% over the last 30 years. So that obviously affects food supplies. Next slide, please. So our Missouri chapter, we started just a little over a year ago, and I know that there are folks on this, probably this webinar, that are from Illinois. There is an Illinois chapter, it's in the central, and there's an advocate up in northern Illinois, but we're certainly happy to work with our friends across the river here in terms of Illinois regarding the programs. We've got a very active chapter, something like 6+ active projects. We're trying to map out what's going on throughout the state and be able to, things like lights out programs are part of our core effort here. Next, please. So the question is, what really can we do about light? And, you know, actually most people don't really think too much about light. We do have the questions of like, why do we even light to start with? Well, part of it is that we have to do it for safety reasons. We have to do it for tasks, but sometimes we just like light. We like to light things up. You can see that at basically gas stations that are lit up really bright, much brighter than what's really needed. And I think that's because we really rely on light for our eyes. Next, please. So the question is, what can we do? Different than lots of types of pollution, the neat thing about lights is that when you turn them off, the light goes out. It's not like there's an after cleanup effect per se. There's a thing called the 4 Ps, and what that means is simply use the light in the proper place, at the proper amount, at the proper time, and the proper spectrum. And if you put all those together, you can get a very energy efficient home or property and protect the environment. Next, please. So as an example, this is a pretty typical street light that you might see around. And you can see the red line on the left-hand side. Below the red line is what's called the useful light. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to light up something. And above that is what's called wasted light. And interestingly, one of our board members who did a little paper calculation, napkin calculation, figured out if you just took 1/3 of all the street lights in the country and just save the light from those, that could more than pay for our national park system's budget. So there's a lot of wasted light. What's the point of really putting that up in the air? If you look on the right-hand side, you can see how you can shield light to just simply point the light down to where it's actually directed to where you really want to. Next slide. With the advance of technology, it's really getting pretty cool out there. You can do things like timers, dimmers, photocells. Why would you need a light on when you don't need it? You can have it to time to go off. If you're doing a ball field, for example, you don't necessarily need all the lights on to chalk the field. You can dim them down. So there's a really lot of great technology that really can make a big difference on how much light is going in the air. Next. A factor that a lot of folks don't really think about is the spectrum of light that you have. So when you buy a light bulb, the old incandescent light bulbs had a certain spectrum, and you can see at the very top there's a sunlight spectrum. And we do love LEDs. If you go ahead and move the slide just a little bit there, just advance it down, please. There you go. You can see the LEDs right here. They have a little different spectrum. They're a little bit on the bluer light range. Now, our eyes only capture so much light, but what happens is the blue light spectrum can actually start impacting ecosystems. And you want to make sure that whenever you buy light, that you get the proper spectrum. Next, please. So this is an example where we're saying that they're starting on the left-hand side is called 1000 Kelvin all the way to the very far right where there's 10,000 Kelvin. And that red line is a divider. Below that is considered friendly lighting, and above that is considered outside the spectrum that we would like to see. So whenever you buy lights, you want to be looking for that spectrum. In fact, it turns out that even the 3000 is too high for some animals and insects. So we're trying to even lower that. So next slide, please. Whenever you buy a bulb, and if you go ahead and just move the slide one more to circle that, there you go. Whenever you go purchase a bulb, let's say a light bulb somewhere, you have to look on the box. But if you look on the box, you'll see this little graph. It's pretty typical where it has a graph that says warm, and then maybe on the other side cool. And if you see the 2700K, that means that's 2700 Kelvin right there. So that would be in the safe range. And by the way, the warm lights are actually more like what you would expect, kind of a little bit of a orangey, a little bit of a look, versus that very bright white that's almost like blinding kind of thing. And you can see the Kelvin scale on the left-hand side where blue light is actually very blue. It's like a 10,000, that's the northern blue sky type of light. So this is a really good way to take a look at light bulbs. Next, please. Now, if you actually go out and purchase lights, let's say you want to find those lights that have the shield, you can go out to typically hardware stores. You can find dark sky approved lighting, and you can see on the right-hand side how lights are basically stopped down. Next, please. The thing to think about is that we're so focused on saving money sometimes that, and it's great, LEDs will give you 70% savings, but they will actually ramp up and actually make it much brighter than we really need to. So energy efficiency isn't just everything. We have to be thinking about the spectrum, the time, all the different parts of the 4Ps. Next, please. And importantly, we get a lot of questions from the public, and one of those is I have an auto dealership coming next to me, and I'm worried about lights in my house, but also sometimes the neighbors are simply shining lights in your house. Good lighting planning makes good for good neighbors. And I suggest you take a look at that around your own home. Next, please. There you go. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Don, for that. So right now we're going to be taking some questions for the panelists. So again, if you do have questions, you can post those in the live chat underneath the video here. And let's see what questions we have coming in. All right. Okay, so here we have a question. This one is for Tara. Why do birds travel at night?
So birds travel at night for a number of reasons. Kind of discussed earlier, I think John touched on it a bit, but just to kind of reiterate it, one is because the conditions at night are usually a lot nicer than they are during the day. So it's just a lot more friendlier environment to fly in. Another reason is to be away from predators. So of course, lots of predators are around during the day, but so it's just ultimately safer to fly at night. And then the last reason is, it's kind of how they used to travel. They look at the stars. So the stars help guide them north and south, depending if they're going to their breeding or wintering ground. And so those are the three main reasons why birds migrate at night.
Thanks, Tara. So it looks like we have another question here. What are some of the other cities that are dangerous for migrating birds? Could one of you guys answer that for us?
Well, this is Don. I'm actually doing a presentation in Kansas City tomorrow night, and it turns out Kansas City is 7th and 8th. So St. Louis is 5th and 6th, meaning 5th being the spring and 6th in the fall. Well, Kansas City is 7th and 8th. So this is the one place I don't want to lead between over Kansas City.
All right, thanks, Don. And let's see. All right. Here's another question for you. What happens when light pollution disorients a bird? Maybe Jean or Tara could answer that for us.
I can take it. So when light pollution disorients a bird, sometimes it's what we can call kind of like a light funnel. So birds will actually get trapped in the bright lights that are being shown pretty much up into the sky. And so this leads to a couple of things. So of course they get disoriented, they kind of get trapped, they can't leave, but it ultimately ends up either delaying their migration. So they end up getting overexhausted, potentially colliding with a building. If that doesn't happen, then they use a lot of their resources that they've been, stocking up for that journey. And so it kind of leaves them in a worse shape than what they could have been in as they migrate through.
Thanks, Tara. All right. So it looks like those are all the questions that have been posted so far. I'm not seeing any more come in on our feed. All right, and again, if you do have questions for these panelists, we will have a resources slide coming up at the end, so you can always contact them for more questions. All right, and just as a reminder, coming up next Friday, we will have another virtual Bird Friendly Friday at 2 p.m. And so this one is going to be on migration along the Mississippi Flyway. And this will be, again, at 2 p.m. May 1st. And let's see. And we just want to thank you guys for joining us today for this presentation. We hope that you learned a little bit more about birds and light pollution and how they impact one another, and hopefully can come up with some good ideas on how you can help those birds at night and hopefully help your bills as well. So for that, we want to thank you. And then here is our presenter slide where you can find information to contact our panelists today, as well as some additional resources on International Dark Sky Week and others. So for that, we want to thank you guys for joining us today.